The sun rose steadily over Hudson International Airport, casting long shadows across the polished floors of the bustling terminal. The early morning hum filled the air. Travelers murmured over cups of coffee, suitcase wheels rattled across tiles, and the faint echo of flight announcements drifted from overhead speakers. Stepping into the first-class lounge was Naomi Ellis. At just 22, she was the youngest partner at her investment firm, an achievement earned through relentless dedication and countless late nights. Her navy blazer was pressed to perfection, the crisp collar of her blouse peeking out just below. Her soft, coiled curls framed her face, highlighting the quiet strength that defined her. But as Naomi moved toward the window, she felt it, the weight of glances, the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. The questions were unspoken but unmistakable. How did she get here? Does she belong? Naomi carefully set her leather carry-on beside her seat, her gaze drifting out across the runway as planes taxied in the morning light. Over the years, she had grown accustomed to moments like these. Yet no matter how much success she achieved, the stares and whispered judgments never fully disappeared. Her shoulders straightened slightly, and she allowed herself a soft breath, just as her mother's voice echoed in her mind. Naomi, you'll face walls. But remember, how you respond is what defines you. No one can make you feel small without your permission. Her mother, Elaine Ellis, had forged her path as one of the first Black women to lead a Fortune 500 company. Naomi had grown up watching Elaine navigate boardrooms with a grace that seemed unshakable, and she carried that legacy with her now. Can I help you? The question pulled Naomi from her thoughts. She turned to find a flight attendant standing just a few feet away. Her name tag read Caroline Porter in bold black lettering. Her uniform was pristine, and her sharp eyes flickered with quiet authority. She appeared to be in her early 50s, her silver-streaked hair tightly twisted into a bun that left no room for imperfection. No, thank you, Naomi replied with a polite smile. Caroline lingered, her gaze drifting from Naomi's face to the neatly folded boarding pass on the table beside her. The slight narrowing of Caroline's eyes wasn't lost on Naomi. Are you sure you're in the right section? Caroline's tone hovered between professional courtesy and restrained skepticism. Naomi's smile faltered for the briefest of moments, but she recovered quickly. Without hesitation, she picked up the boarding pass and held it out, her hand steady. Caroline leaned in just enough to glance over the details. Her eyes skimmed the pass, betraying no apology as she straightened with a curt nod. Very well. Her footsteps clicked sharply against the tiles as she turned away, leaving Naomi to exhale quietly. Her fingers brushed against the cool leather handle of her carry-on. No matter how poised she appeared, encounters like these always left a bitter edge. From the corner of her eye, Naomi caught the faint curiosity lingering in the glances of a few nearby passengers. Some looked away hastily when she met their gaze, while others watched more openly. Near the lounge entrance, Caroline Porter leaned against the polished counter, her eyes drifting back toward Naomi, as if drawn by something she couldn't quite place. There was something about the young woman that unsettled her. Caroline, are you coming? The voice came from Sofia Alvarez, a younger flight attendant whose warm smile softened the tension. She stood a few steps away, clipboard in hand, her presence far more welcoming than Caroline's. Caroline straightened at Sofia's call, smoothing the front of her uniform one last time. But as she walked away, her gaze lingered over her shoulder, fixed on Naomi Ellis. Naomi adjusted the strap of her watch and leaned back in her chair. Outside, another plane roared to life, its engines vibrating faintly against the glass. She told herself to let the moment go, to focus on the recent victory of sealing a multi-million-dollar deal and the bright future that awaited her. But deep down, Naomi felt it. This flight was different. The quiet storm that seemed to follow her wasn't finished brewing. Naomi Ellis adjusted the strap of her watch, leaning back in the plush first-class chair as the early morning sunlight streamed through the large windows. Outside, a jet hummed to life, its engines vibrating softly against the glass. She told herself to let the earlier encounter with Caroline Porter drift away, but a quiet voice in her mind whispered that this wasn't over. She had felt it before, this subtle tension, like distant thunder hinting at an approaching storm. Caroline's lingering glance as she left the lounge left behind a faint unease. Naomi couldn't shake the thought that the turbulence ahead might arrive long before the plane left the runway. Now seated in the first-class cabin, Naomi shifted in her seat, running her hands lightly over the smooth armrests. The hum of the engines beneath her created a steady rhythm, lulling most passengers into quiet comfort. Outside the window, the sky stretched endlessly, a sea of soft clouds blanketing the world below. But despite the peaceful view, Naomi felt something off. Up near the galley, Caroline Porter stood stiffly, eyes scanning the rows ahead. Every so often, her gaze lingered on Naomi, sharp and assessing, though she tried to disguise it behind professional detachment. Naomi had grown adept at recognizing moments like this. She could sense when she was being watched a little too closely, as if her very presence needed justifying. Whether in boardrooms or high-end corporate galas, it was a script she had learned by heart. Her thoughts drifted back to a memory, 2 years earlier, when she was just an intern, wide-eyed and eager. At a company gala, a senior executive mistook her for event staff and asked her to fetch him a drink. The sting of that moment had followed her long after the party ended, lingering like an old scar. Her mother's words surfaced in her mind, as they always did in moments like this. "Naomi, composure is your strength. Never let anyone rattle that." Elaine Ellis had built her career on exactly that principle, breaking glass ceilings and carving out space where none existed before. Naomi had inherited that same quiet resilience, but knowing the script didn't make the scenes any easier to endure. The sound of soft footsteps pulled Naomi back to the present. "Would you like something to drink, Miss Ellis?" It was Sophia Alvarez, her warm smile a welcome contrast to Caroline's cold detachment. The drinks cart rattled lightly in front of her as she poured beverages with practiced ease. "Just water, thank you," Naomi replied, keeping her tone polite but distant. She appreciated Sophia's kindness, but the tension in the cabin hung heavy. Relaxing wasn't easy. Sophia poured the water carefully, her motions calm and precise. Naomi's fingers grazed the cool surface of the glass as she accepted it. A few feet away, Caroline lingered near the front of the cabin, watching the interaction like a hawk. Her eyes narrowed slightly, though she said nothing. Across the aisle, Richard Barnes signaled for Caroline's attention. An older man, his tailored suit and gold cufflinks announced his wealth even louder than his presence. He barely glanced at Naomi as Caroline approached. "Champagne, please," Richard said, his voice dripping with quiet entitlement. Caroline's demeanor shifted immediately. She poured his drink with exaggerated grace, smiling politely, almost deferentially. But as she continued down the aisle, her gaze hardened again. The moment she reached Naomi's row, Caroline's focus seemed to skip entirely over her. Naomi watched in silence as Caroline passed by without so much as a glance, stopping only to serve the couple seated directly behind her. Her grip on the water glass tightened ever so slightly. The snub was subtle, easily dismissible as coincidence to anyone else, but Naomi recognized it for what it was. From across the aisle, Richard Barnes chuckled softly, as though he too understood the unspoken slight. Naomi caught his gaze briefly, her expression unreadable, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Beneath the surface, however, frustration simmered. As Sophia returned from the rear of the cabin, she hesitated near Naomi's seat. Her eyes flickered with quiet unease, a silent acknowledgement of the tension she had witnessed. "Miss Ellis," Sophia said gently, her voice low, "if there's anything else you need, please don't hesitate to ask." Naomi met Sophia's gaze, appreciating the silent solidarity behind her words. "Thank you," Naomi replied, her tone calm but firm. Though Sophia's kindness softened the edge of the moment, it didn't erase the growing weight pressing down on the cabin. Other passengers had begun to take notice. 2 rows back, a woman discreetly raised her phone, angling it as though she anticipated something more to unfold. Another passenger, an older man in a navy blazer, frowned subtly as his gaze lingered on Caroline, disapproval etched across his features. The tension, like static electricity, buzzed faintly beneath the hum of the engines. Naomi sat quietly, composed but alert. She could feel it. Something was shifting. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Naomi Ellis sat still, the hum of the engines the only constant in the increasingly tense first-class cabin. Her grip on the water glass shifted slightly, the cold condensation pressing against her palm as she replayed the earlier exchange with Caroline Porter in her mind. Across the aisle, an older man frowned, his gaze flicking between Naomi and Caroline. 2 rows back, a woman discreetly angled her phone, recording quietly, sensing the undercurrent of conflict that was slowly building. Caroline, either oblivious or indifferent to the growing scrutiny, continued her rounds with calm efficiency. To her, the slight was insignificant, a fleeting moment that would dissolve by the time the wheels touched the runway. But Naomi knew better. This wasn't new. It wasn't surprising, it was just another addition to the long line of silent battles she fought daily. The minutes dragged on, and the cabin grew quieter, save for the steady thrum of the engines. Naomi remained composed, but her thoughts raced. She remembered her mother's advice, words spoken after that humiliating gala years ago. Choose your battles, Naomi. Some are worth the risk. Stand tall when it matters. Naomi took a slow sip of water, letting the coolness ground her. Her gaze followed Caroline as she retreated toward the front of the cabin. There was a storm inside Naomi, quiet but building strength. She didn't know how or when, but she could feel it. This flight was going to shift. As the plane climbed higher, the turbulence inside the cabin mirrored the unseen currents outside. Naomi sensed it. Something inevitable was approaching. And this time, she wasn't going to stay silent. The steady hum of the airplane filled the space as Naomi adjusted her seat slightly. Her hands rested lightly on the armrests, but tension radiated from her fingertips, tightening and loosening as if keeping time with the pulse of unease in the air. Outside the window, the sky stretched endlessly, clouds forming a soft quilt below. The scene should have been calming, but Naomi's focus remained sharp. Up front, Caroline Porter stood near the galley, clipboard held tightly to her chest like a shield. Every few moments, her eyes flicked toward Naomi. Whenever Naomi looked back, Caroline's gaze darted away, but the stiffness in her posture betrayed her discomfort. Naomi knew what this was. She didn't just occupy a seat in first class, she owned it. And that confidence, that quiet ease, unsettled Caroline in ways the flight attendant likely couldn't articulate. Naomi had seen this pattern before. She recognized the lingering glances, the subtle doubt hidden behind rehearsed professionalism. It was exhausting. Her mother's voice surfaced again, steady as always. Strength lies in your composure, Naomi. Never let them see you falter. But today, Naomi's composure was being tested. Caroline began moving toward her, slow and deliberate, each step measured. She stopped directly at Naomi's row, clipboard raised slightly in front of her. Miss Ellis, I'll need to verify your boarding pass again. Naomi blinked, the calm mask never leaving her face. She set her water glass down carefully, tilting her head as she looked up. I already showed it when I boarded, she replied, her tone unwavering. Yes, Caroline answered smoothly, though there was something sharper lurking beneath the surface. But it's standard procedure to confirm passenger details periodically. I'm sure you understand. A murmur rippled quietly through the nearby seats. Naomi caught the subtle exchange of glances as passengers shifted, leaning in slightly to watch. Naomi inhaled slowly, fingers brushing the edge of her leather bag. Without a word, she retrieved her boarding pass and handed it to Caroline. Their eyes met. Naomi's gaze was steady, unwavering as Caroline lingered far longer than necessary, her eyes skimming over the details as if searching for something, anything, that would justify her suspicions. But nothing appeared. After a long pause, Caroline handed the pass back with a tight smile. Thank you for your cooperation, she said, pivoting without another word. Naomi slipped the pass back into her bag, her calm intact. But inside, frustration simmered. It wasn't over. Minutes later, Caroline returned. Her grip on the clipboard seemed firmer, and this time, her expression was rigid. Miss Ellis, she began, her tone loud enough to be overheard, I'm afraid I'll need you to move to another seat. Naomi's eyes narrowed. Excuse me, she asked, her voice clipped but calm. This section is reserved for passengers with valid first-class tickets, Caroline continued, enunciating every word carefully, as if Naomi might not understand. The absurdity of the statement echoed through the cabin, murmurs following closely behind. Naomi straightened in her seat, her calm exterior cracking ever so slightly as the weight of disbelief settled in. I have a valid first-class ticket, she replied firmly. Caroline's stance hardened. If that's the case, I'll need to confirm it with the flight manifest. Until then, I must ask that you cooperate by moving to economy. Naomi felt the shift in the room. Passengers were listening, watching. A woman 2 rows back discreetly lifted her phone, angling it toward the aisle once again. Across from Naomi, Richard Barnes smirked, shaking his head slightly in amusement. A silver-haired man in the row ahead cleared his throat audibly, his disapproval unhidden. Naomi's gaze didn't waver. I'm not moving, she said, each word deliberate. You've already verified my ticket. I belong here. Her voice sliced through the murmurs, silencing the whispers momentarily. For a brief second, doubt flickered across Caroline's face, but she straightened, gripping the clipboard tighter. If you refuse to cooperate, I'll have to involve the captain. Naomi leaned back slightly, crossing one leg over the other with deliberate grace. Please do, she replied, ice-lacing her tone. Caroline hesitated before turning sharply on her heel, disappearing toward the cockpit. As she vanished, the murmurs swelled once again, filling the cabin like distant thunder. Naomi remained still, eyes fixed on the window, but her heart pounded. This wasn't the end. A confrontation was brewing. And this time, Naomi wouldn't back down. Naomi Ellis sat unmoving, her gaze locked on Caroline Porter as the older flight attendant stood rigidly, clipboard held like a shield. I'm not moving, Naomi said, her voice calm but unyielding. Each word was deliberate, hanging in the air and silencing the murmurs around her. Across the aisle, the silver-haired man cleared his throat loudly, muttering under his breath. His disapproval was plain, cutting through the tense quiet like a knife. Near the drinks cart, Sofia Alvarez hesitated, her hands nervously brushing over the handle. Her expression flickered with frustration and discomfort, but she remained where she stood. Caroline's face flushed faintly, though she masked it with the same stiff professionalism that had defined her since Naomi first boarded. Tightening her grip on the clipboard, she squared her shoulders. I'll have to speak to the captain if you refuse to cooperate, Caroline said, her tone clipped but strained beneath the surface. Naomi leaned back in her seat, crossing her legs with slow, deliberate grace. Her calm exterior belied the storm steadily rising within her. Please do, she replied coldly, her eyes never leaving Caroline's. For a brief moment, Caroline hesitated, her fingers twitching slightly against the edges of the clipboard. Then, with sharp, mechanical movements, she spun on her heel and walked briskly toward the cockpit, disappearing behind the curtain. The murmurs in the cabin swelled again as soon as she left. Naomi remained still, her body composed but her thoughts racing. The tension clung to the cabin like humidity, thick and inescapable. Unbelievable, the older man across the aisle muttered louder this time. His voice carried a tone of disgust, his gaze lingering on the direction Caroline had gone. Sophia shifted uncomfortably, then slowly approached Naomi's row. Miss Ellis, she began softly, her voice laced with quiet apology. If there's anything you need, please don't hesitate to ask. Naomi turned her head slightly, meeting Sophia's gaze with calm but resolute eyes. Thank you, Naomi said simply, but the weight in her voice said more than the words alone. She returned her attention to the window, watching as the clouds stretched endlessly beneath them. The quiet expanse outside felt like a world apart from the storm simmering within the cabin. Naomi's reflection stared back at her through the glass, calm and collected, yet edged with the frustration she refused to let spill over. This wasn't the first time she had experienced something like this, and it likely wouldn't be the last. The hum of the engines remained steady, but it did little to ease the tightening tension that pulsed through the air. Naomi Ellis sat motionless, her breathing slow and controlled as she felt the weight of every glance, every whispered exchange behind her. At the front of the cabin, Caroline Porter returned with quiet but deliberate steps, her eyes scanning the rows of passengers like she was rehearsing her next move. When her gaze fell on Naomi, it lingered for a heartbeat too long. Naomi didn't react. She had spent years perfecting the delicate art of composure, the kind that shielded her in spaces that silently questioned her presence. But her hand, resting lightly on the armrest, betrayed her. Her fingers pressed tightly against the leather, tension pooling just beneath the surface. Finally, Caroline approached again, this time with the rigid posture of authority. Miss Ellis, Caroline said, her tone cool but forceful. "I need to verify your boarding pass once more." Naomi's eyes narrowed slightly. She blinked, surprised by the audacity of the request. Slowly, Naomi placed her glass of water onto the tray table, tilting her head to meet Caroline's unwavering gaze. "I've already shown it to you," Naomi said, her voice even. Caroline's lips pressed into a thin line. "Yes, but there seems to be a discrepancy with the manifest. I'm sure you understand the need to confirm." The tension thickened. Nearby passengers exchanged glances. A few leaned forward slightly, sensing the brewing confrontation. Naomi sighed softly, opening her bag with deliberate care. She retrieved her boarding pass, handing it over without a word. Her gaze never left Caroline's face. Caroline examined the document longer than necessary, her eyes skimming over the details with exaggerated focus. Naomi could tell she wasn't looking for a mistake. She was hoping for one. But when nothing surfaced, Caroline's eyes flickered briefly with something Naomi couldn't quite place. Finally, Caroline handed the pass back with a stiff nod. "Thank you for your cooperation," she said, her words devoid of any sincerity. Naomi placed the boarding pass back into her bag, her hands steady despite the irritation bubbling just below the surface. For a moment, Naomi thought that might be the end of it, but Caroline wasn't finished. Minutes later, Caroline returned. Her clipboard was still in hand, but this time her posture seemed colder, more rigid. "Miss Ellis," she began, her voice louder than before, "I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to move to another seat." Naomi's heart pounded. The words felt like a physical blow. "Excuse me?" Naomi asked, her tone sharp but controlled. "This section is reserved for passengers with valid first-class tickets," Caroline said, enunciating the words carefully, as if Naomi hadn't heard her the first time. Murmurs rippled through the cabin. Naomi sat up straighter, her calm exterior starting to fracture. "I have a valid first-class ticket," Naomi replied, her voice firm. Caroline's jaw tightened. "If that's the case, I'll need to confirm it with the captain. Until then, I ask for your cooperation in moving to an economy seat." Naomi could feel every set of eyes on her now. Across the aisle, Richard Barnes smirked faintly, shaking his head in what felt like amusement. A woman 2 rows back quietly raised her phone once more, ensuring she caught every moment of the exchange. Naomi met Caroline's gaze directly. "I'm not moving," Naomi said clearly. "You've already verified my ticket. I belong here." Her words cut through the noise, and for a brief moment, the entire cabin seemed to pause. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Caroline's face. But she recovered quickly. "If you continue to refuse," Caroline said, her voice now clipped with frustration, "I will involve the captain." Naomi leaned back, crossing her legs again, with practiced poise. "Go ahead," she said coldly. Caroline hesitated for a fraction of a second, before turning on her heel and striding toward the cockpit. Naomi's gaze followed her until she disappeared from view. She could feel it now. The confrontation was far from over. And this time, Naomi wasn't backing down. Naomi Ellis sat tall in her seat, eyes locked on Caroline Porter as the flight attendant's grip on her clipboard tightened. "I'm not moving," Naomi repeated, her voice calm but unyielding. "You've already verified my ticket. It clearly shows I belong here." Her words hung in the air, heavy enough to press down on the quiet murmurs circling the cabin. For the first time, Caroline's facade wavered. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. But even as doubt crept in, the rigidness in her posture betrayed her unwillingness to back down. "If you refuse to cooperate, I'll have to involve the captain," Caroline warned, raising her voice slightly, as if hoping the surrounding passengers would offer her validation. Naomi's expression didn't shift. "Please do," she replied, cool and firm. "I'll be right here." Caroline hesitated for just a second longer, her knuckles whitening around the edge of the clipboard. Then, without another word, she turned briskly and strode toward the cockpit. Her heels clicked sharply against the floor, the sound cutting through the uneasy silence. As soon as she disappeared, the murmurs swelled. Naomi remained seated, outwardly composed, but her heart pounded in her chest. "Ridiculous," the silver-haired man across the aisle muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. A few rows back, the woman with her phone continued recording, her eyes fixed on Naomi's seat. Sofia Alvarez appeared beside Naomi, her soft voice laced with quiet regret. Miss Ellis, Sophia said gently, leaning just close enough to be heard over the hushed conversation around them. I'm sorry for everything. Please know, not all of us feel this way. Naomi turned toward her, the stiffness in her expression softening slightly. Thank you, Naomi replied, her words steady but carrying far more weight than the simple phrase suggested. Sophia gave her a brief, reassuring nod before returning to the galley. Passengers around them began to speak more openly now, their frustration mounting. This is absurd, one woman whispered loudly enough to be heard. You'd think they'd know better than this, someone else chimed in. Naomi glanced back out the window, her reflection faint against the glass. The sky beyond remained calm, serene, a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside her. She let out a quiet breath and gripped the armrest lightly. It wasn't over. Not yet. Unable to stay still, Naomi unbuckled her seatbelt and rose from her chair. She ignored the subtle glances that followed her and made her way toward the bathroom, the narrow aisle feeling far too confining. Inside the cramped space, Naomi leaned against the door, exhaling deeply as the weight of the moment pressed down on her. Her reflection in the small mirror stared back at her, the composure she had worn for so long beginning to show cracks. She allowed herself a moment to feel the frustration, the anger, the exhaustion. These moments, though familiar, never grew easier. Naomi cupped her hands under the faucet, splashing cold water onto her face. The sharp chill grounded her, easing the tightness in her chest. As droplets trickled down her skin, she closed her eyes, drawing in a slow breath. Never let them see you falter, Naomi. Your strength is in your composure. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind, steady as ever. Straightening, Naomi reached for her phone, fingers trembling slightly as she dialed a number she knew by heart. Mom, she said softly when the call connected. The warmth and authority of Elaine Ellis's voice filled the line almost immediately. Naomi, what's wrong? Elaine's voice was calm but instantly alert. Naomi recounted the situation, her tone steady despite the lingering anger beneath it. Elaine listened silently, her breathing measured, waiting until Naomi had finished before responding. I see, Elaine finally said, her voice low and deliberate. Stay calm, I'll handle this. Naomi exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders easing just slightly. Thank you, Mom. You're stronger than this, Elaine reminded her. Don't let them rattle you. I'll make a few calls now. This will be resolved. As the call ended, Naomi remained still for a moment, clutching her phone tightly. Her reflection stared back at her once more, this time steadier. The vulnerability that lingered before had been replaced with something sharper. Resolve. Naomi stepped out of the bathroom and returned to her seat, her shoulders squared, her chin lifted. The murmurs around the cabin hushed as she walked by, but the weight of passenger gazes followed her. At the front, Caroline had returned from the cockpit, standing stiffly by the galley. Her eyes flickered toward Naomi, and for the briefest second, unease crossed her features. Naomi didn't look away. Her calm exterior had returned, but beneath it, something stronger simmered, a quiet storm, waiting for the right moment to break. For the first time, Naomi felt the balance of power in the cabin begin to shift, and for once it wasn't her place being questioned. The hum of the engines became distant, drowned beneath the rising tension that gripped the cabin. Naomi Ellis sat upright, hands resting lightly on her lap as her mind raced. Around her, the low murmurs of passengers formed an undercurrent of unease. At the front, Caroline Porter stood rigid, her usual cool demeanor slipping. Her eyes darted between the cockpit door and the watchful faces of the passengers. Phones were out, cameras discreetly recorded, lenses catching every unfolding moment. Whispers swelled, no longer hidden, as the scene gained momentum. The intercom crackled, and the steady voice of Captain Daniel Long cut through the air. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Due to unforeseen circumstances, we will be making an unscheduled landing at the nearest airport. Please remain seated and follow all crew instructions. Thank you for your patience. Gas rippled through the cabin. Naomi's stomach twisted, her mind racing to process the words. An emergency landing? Passengers exchanged uneasy glances as Caroline disappeared briskly into the cockpit, leaving behind a trail of uncertainty. Sophia reappeared at Naomi's side, her eyes filled with apology and quiet determination. Miss Ellis, Sophia said softly, leaning closer. I'm so sorry for all of this. I promise, not everyone feels the way she does. Naomi met Sophia's gaze, the warmth in the flight attendant's expression offering the smallest comfort. Thank you, Naomi replied, her voice calm but resolute. The words carried more weight than they seemed, acknowledging Sophia's courage in a moment when silence might have felt safer. As the plane descended, Naomi knew one thing for certain. The confrontation wasn't over. But this time, she wasn't standing alone. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder, passengers openly voicing their disapproval. Typical power trip, a young man muttered, his phone still discreetly aimed at the aisle. Naomi Ellis caught fragments of the conversations, words laced with indignation and quiet support. For the first time, she felt the tide shifting in her favor. Outside the window, the engine's hum lowered, signaling the descent. Clouds gave way to glimpses of city streets and fields below, growing larger with each passing second. The jolt of the landing gear hitting the tarmac reverberated through the plane, and Naomi's heart raced as she peered out at the runway. Uniformed personnel stood near the terminal, their presence undeniable even at a distance. Airline representatives, security officials, and, to Naomi's surprise, members of the press clustered near the gate. Her phone buzzed softly in her hand. A message lit up the screen. "Mom, I'm here. Stay strong." A flicker of relief settled over Naomi. If Elaine Ellis was there, things were about to shift even more. The cabin door opened, and harsh runway lights spilled inside. Passengers began to rise, their movements hesitant, uncertainty hanging thick in the air. At the front of the aisle, Richard Barnes stood, his posture upright and unbothered as he made his way toward the exit. Close behind him, Caroline Porter clutched her clipboard tightly, as if it were the only thing holding her together. Naomi's eyes followed them, her jaw tightening as she braced for what came next. Beside her, Sofia Alvarez lingered, her presence small but steady. "Whatever happens next," Sofia said softly, "just know you're not alone in this." Naomi nodded, her grip tightening around her phone as she rose from her seat. The murmurs quieted as she moved down the aisle, the weight of a dozen eyes trailing her. Her steps were deliberate, measured, as if each stride toward the cabin door was a reminder she belonged here. Stepping out onto the stairs, Naomi was met by a wall of scrutiny. Cameras flashed, reporters whispered among themselves, and uniformed personnel observed with unreadable expressions. At the edge of the commotion stood Elaine Ellis, her tailored suit impeccable, her presence commanding. Naomi's eyes met her mother's, and in that brief exchange, the tension that gripped her chest began to loosen. Elaine's gaze was steady, a silent promise written across her features. Naomi quickened her steps, descending the stairs with purpose. By the time she reached the bottom, Elaine had already moved toward her, cutting through the chaos like a beacon. A gentle hand on Naomi's shoulder grounded her, as Elaine's eyes swept over the scene, calm but assessing. The game had shifted. Justice was no longer an abstract hope. It had arrived, and everyone was about to witness it. Floodlights bathed the runway in a cold glow, stretching shadows across the tarmac. Naomi's footsteps echoed faintly as she followed Elaine toward a cluster of airline officials waiting beyond the press line. Behind her, the buzz of cameras and murmurs of passengers blurred into white noise. Elaine Ellis, flanked by members of her executive team, carried herself with an authority that silenced even the most skeptical observer. Naomi's shoulders eased slightly under the weight of her mother's unwavering support. Caroline Porter trailed a few feet behind, her clipboard now more of a shield than a tool. The earlier confidence she carried had unraveled, leaving behind a tension she couldn't fully mask. As they came to a stop near the terminal entrance, Elaine turned to address the press. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice slicing through the chatter like a blade. Cameras turned toward her, flashes illuminating the moment as it unfolded. "I am Elaine Ellis, CEO of this airline. I have been informed of a deeply troubling incident on board this flight. Let me be perfectly clear. Discrimination of any kind will not be tolerated in this company." A ripple of murmurs spread through the gathered crowd. The weight of Elaine's words landed like thunder, cutting across the night air. Passengers began stepping forward, emboldened by her presence. An older woman with a stern expression raised her hand. "I saw everything," she said firmly, her voice unwavering. That flight attendant was out of line. She singled out this young woman for no reason. A younger man stepped closer, holding his phone aloft. "I got the whole thing on video," he added. "She didn't deserve any of it." Caroline's face paled as the testimonies piled on, her grip on the clipboard tightening. Naomi glanced sideways at her, but there was no satisfaction in watching the cracks spread. This wasn't about one flight attendant's behavior, it was about something larger. Elaine's eyes locked onto Caroline, her expression cold but controlled. "Miss Porter," Elaine said with quiet authority, "I trust you now understand the gravity of the situation." Caroline swallowed, her voice barely audible. I was following protocol." Elaine's gaze hardened. "Protocol does not justify discrimination. Your actions reflect on more than just yourself. They reflect on this airline, and as CEO, I will not allow it." The silence that followed was deafening. Passengers whispered among themselves, some nodding in quiet approval. The woman who had spoken earlier stepped forward again. "She deserves more than just an apology," the woman said, her gaze flickering toward Naomi. Elaine's eyes softened as she looked at Naomi, the warmth of a mother's pride breaking through her otherwise steely exterior. "She will receive more," Elaine replied. Turning back to the cameras, Elaine addressed the crowd with quiet resolve. "This incident is a reminder of the work we still have to do. Discrimination thrives in silence, and today, silence was not an option. I will personally ensure that every employee in this airline undergoes mandatory training on diversity, equity, and inclusion. We will be better. We must be better." A quiet applause spread through the passengers. Elaine's eyes met Naomi's once more, pride etched across her features. For the first time since the flight began, Naomi felt the weight lift from her chest. The fight wasn't over, but they were winning. Caroline Porter's knuckles whitened around the edges of her clipboard, as though it might anchor her against the rising tide of disapproval swelling around her. Near the terminal entrance, Richard Barnes shifted uneasily. His usual self-assured posture seemed to shrink under the collective scrutiny of the press and passengers. He took a subtle step back, but Elaine Ellis's sharp gaze caught him instantly. "And you," Elaine said, her tone slicing through the air with the precision of a blade. Richard froze. "As a senior representative of this airline, you had a responsibility to ensure the dignity and fairness of all passengers," Elaine continued. "Instead, you stood by and allowed this to happen." Richard opened his mouth, but his usual smugness faltered. I had no idea it had gone this far," he stammered, the weight of the eyes on him rendering his protests weak. Elaine held up a hand, silencing him. "This is enough," she said, her voice calm but unrelenting. "Your complicity speaks louder than any justification. There will be consequences." Naomi Ellis stood silently beside her mother, her composure unwavering. She didn't need to speak. The voices of the passengers and Elaine's commanding presence spoke louder than words ever could. A moment later, Sofia Alvarez stepped forward. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice did not. "I saw what happened," Sofia said, her gaze flickering to Naomi. "Caroline's behavior was unacceptable. She treated Miss Ellis unfairly from the moment she boarded the plane." Caroline's mask of professionalism began to crack. "I was following protocol," she muttered defensively. Elaine turned to face her, eyes cold and unyielding. "Protocol does not justify discrimination," Elaine said. "Your actions reflect not only on yourself but on this company, and I will not stand for it." The silence that followed felt heavy, pressing down on everyone present. Elaine's gaze swept across the gathered crowd. As the press shifted forward, microphones held high, Elaine's voice carried with renewed urgency. "Today is about more than one incident," she said, her eyes locking onto each camera. "It's about the change we must demand, together." She paused, letting her words settle. "Stories like this remind us why we must stand up, speak out, and confront injustice wherever we see it." Elaine's eyes scanned the faces of the passengers, the press, and the onlookers gathering near the terminal. Then she added, her voice softening but still firm, "If this story has resonated with you, if you believe in standing for justice, don't just watch. Be part of the change. Subscribe to our channel, share this story, and amplify the voices that need to be heard." Naomi glanced at her mother, a flicker of pride crossing her face. Elaine's words weren't just a call to action, they were a promise. The press cameras clicked furiously, capturing the gravity of the moment. Caroline stood frozen, the weight of her guilt finally sinking in, stripping away the last of her defiance. Elaine turned back to Naomi, her expression softening as the fierce CEO gave way to the protective mother. "This isn't over," Elaine said quietly, her hand resting on Naomi's shoulder. "But we're going to make it right." Naomi nodded, quiet strength reflecting in her eyes. Together, they turned to face the crowd, each step forward etched with the promise of justice. The VIP lounge at the airport was unusually quiet. The hum of fluorescent lights and the low murmur of voices were the only sounds cutting through the stillness. Elaine Ellis stood at the center of the room, her posture commanding, her sharp gaze moving between the faces of those gathered. Her tailored suit remained pristine, a testament to the meticulous control she wielded in every aspect of her life. Today, that control was channeled toward securing justice for her daughter. In the corner of the room, Caroline sat stiffly in a chair, her confidence drained. The clipboard she had clung to now lay abandoned on the table, its edges crumpled from the relentless grip of her fingers. Nearby, Richard Barnes hovered, his usual air of authority diminished. His gaze darted nervously around the room as though searching for an escape. Naomi sat beside her mother, her back straight and expression calm. But the tightness around her eyes betrayed the strain of the past few hours. Elaine placed a hand on Naomi's shoulder, the gesture a silent but powerful reassurance. Naomi wasn't facing this alone. At the back of the room, several passengers lingered, their indignation simmering just beneath the surface. Sophia stood near the edge of the group, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She caught Naomi's eye and offered a small, encouraging nod. Elaine broke the silence, her voice sharp but measured. "Before we begin, I want to thank each of you who stepped forward," she said. "Your courage matters. Injustice thrives in silence, and today you refuse to let that happen." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the group. Turning to face Caroline and Richard, Elaine's tone hardened. "Now," she said, "let's address the matter at hand." Caroline flinched slightly, her eyes flicking toward Richard as though searching for support. None came. Caroline straightened her posture, attempting to summon the last threads of her confidence. "I was following protocol," Caroline said, her voice wavering. "I didn't mean to offend anyone." Elaine's eyes narrowed. "Enough," she said, her voice cutting through the excuse. "Your actions were not about protocol. They were about prejudice, and there is no place for prejudice in this company." Caroline's gaze dropped to the floor. Elaine turned toward Richard, her expression unrelenting. "And you, Mr. Barnes, you had every opportunity to intervene, but instead, you chose to stand by." Richard shifted uneasily. I didn't realize the situation had escalated," he said weakly. "You didn't realize, or you chose to ignore it." Elaine's voice was cold. "Either way, you will be held accountable." Elaine's gaze softened only when she turned back to Naomi. "You've shown incredible strength," Elaine said softly. "Your composure in the face of this is a testament to your character. But you shouldn't have had to endure it." Naomi met her mother's eyes, gratitude unspoken but understood. Elaine addressed the group once more. "This incident highlights the work we still have to do," she said. "Discrimination will not be tolerated, not now, not ever. And under my leadership, this company will do better." The room was silent, the weight of Elaine's words lingering. But within that silence, Naomi felt something else. Hope. Caroline Porter's face flushed as she twisted her hands nervously in her lap, eyes darting around the room for refuge. "I didn't realize," she murmured, her voice weak against the weight of the room. Elaine Ellis's gaze hardened, cutting through the excuse like glass. "That is exactly the problem," Elaine snapped, her voice rising just enough to make the gathered crowd stir. "You didn't realize, you didn't think, you acted out of prejudice, and now you must face the consequences." The murmurs swelled louder, rippling through the group of passengers and press standing nearby. From the crowd, a woman with short-cropped hair and a determined expression stepped forward. "We all saw it," the woman said firmly. "This wasn't a misunderstanding. She treated Naomi differently from the moment she stepped onto that plane." Another passenger, a young man holding his phone, nodded in agreement, and when people started recording, she doubled down instead of doing the right thing. It was appalling. Sofia Alvarez stepped forward, her hands trembling, but her voice steady. Caroline ignored Miss Ellis during service, questioned her ticket without reason, and publicly humiliated her, Sophia said, her gaze flicking to Caroline. That's not protocol, that's discrimination. Caroline's shoulders sank further, her once rigid posture crumbling beneath the collective weight of the testimonies. Elaine turned her sharp gaze toward Richard Barnes, narrowing her eyes. And you, Mr. Barnes, she said icily, as a senior representative of this airline, you had every opportunity to step in, to do the right thing. Instead, you chose silence. Why? Richard's smooth demeanor faltered, his usual charm slipping away. I didn't realize the situation had escalated to this point, he stammered, shifting uncomfortably. I was focused on protecting yourself, Elaine finished coldly. Richard's mouth opened slightly, but no defense followed. Well, that ends now, Elaine said, her words crisp and final. Both of you will be held accountable for your actions, or lack thereof. The room fell into a weighted silence, each passenger feeling the shift in the air. Elaine's gaze softened as she turned to Naomi, her voice lowering. Naomi, you've shown incredible strength through this, Elaine said. Your composure in the face of blatant discrimination is a testament to your character, but you shouldn't have had to endure it in the first place. Naomi met her mother's eyes, emotion threatening to surface. She took a slow breath and nodded, the quiet understanding between them needing no words. Elaine straightened, turning back to address the gathered passengers and press. This incident is a stark reminder of the work we still have to do, she declared. Discrimination in any form is unacceptable and will not be tolerated under my leadership. She paused, letting the gravity of her words settle over the room. Effective immediately, I will implement mandatory diversity and bias training for all airline employees. Additionally, we will establish new oversight measures to ensure that incidents like this never happen again. The crowd murmured their approval, a few passengers breaking into quiet applause. Elaine's gaze shifted to the rows of cameras capturing the scene. Her voice carried a renewed urgency. This is about more than one flight, she continued. It's about standing together, demanding better, and refusing to stay silent. If this story has resonated with you, if you believe in justice and equality, don't just listen. Be part of the change. Share this story, amplify these voices, and hold the systems around you accountable. Her eyes swept over the press. Together, we can build a future where stories like this are the exception, not the norm. The cameras clicked relentlessly, documenting the powerful moment. Caroline, now visibly shaken, rose unsteadily from her seat. I'm sorry, she muttered, her voice barely audible. Elaine's gaze didn't waver. Your apology will mean more when it's backed by action, she replied firmly. As the room began to disperse, Elaine turned to Naomi, her expression softening as the fierce CEO gave way to the reassuring mother. This is just the beginning, she said quietly. We've made our stand, but the work isn't over. Naomi offered a small but determined smile. I know, she replied. Together, they stepped forward, each stride toward the waiting press, another step toward justice. A week later. The incident on that flight had become more than a moment. It had sparked a movement. Social media platforms buzzed with hashtags like Tech Justice for Naomi and Equality in the Skies, each post a testament to the power of shared voices. Videos taken by passengers circulated widely, drawing public attention to the reality many had long endured in silence. Naomi Ellis sat at her kitchen table, the morning sun pouring in through the large windows, casting golden light across the room. Her phone vibrated constantly, notifications flooding the screen. Some messages were supportive, filled with encouragement from strangers who saw her as a symbol of quiet resilience. Others, filled with hostility, served as a reminder of the uphill battle society still faced. She sipped her coffee slowly, torn between gratitude and exhaustion. The weight of the attention pressed down on her, but she refused to let it break her. Across the table, Elaine watched her daughter with quiet understanding. You've handled this remarkably well, Elaine said gently. Naomi looked up, her eyes meeting her mother's. It doesn't feel like it, Naomi admitted, her tone laced with vulnerability. It feels overwhelming, like I'm supposed to have all the answers now. But I didn't ask for this. Elaine's expression softened. No, you didn't, she agreed, reaching across the table to place a reassuring hand over Naomi's. But you're here now, and what you're doing matters. Naomi sighed. her grip tightening slightly around her coffee cup. "It's hard to know where to start," she whispered. Elaine gave her hand a gentle squeeze. "You start by being true to yourself," Elaine said, "and by remembering that you don't have to do this alone." Naomi's phone buzzed again, a new message lighting up the screen. "Thank you for standing tall. Your strength has inspired my daughter to speak up at work. She says she finally feels seen." Naomi set the phone down slowly, a faint smile breaking through the heaviness in her chest. Even if the journey was far from over, she could feel it. Change was beginning to take root. Naomi Ellis sat at the kitchen table, her phone buzzing intermittently beside her. Sunlight poured in through the window, casting long streaks of gold across the room, but the warmth did little to dissolve the tension still lingering in her chest. Across from her, Elaine Ellis sipped her tea, eyes quietly observing her daughter. "You're doing more than you realize," Elaine said softly, setting her cup down. "People are listening because you showed strength when others might have folded. Don't take that lightly." Naomi let out a breath, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug. "It's just hard to know where to start," she admitted. "You start by being true to yourself," Elaine replied gently, leaning in. "And by remembering, you don't have to do this alone." The media storm following the incident hadn't let up. Major outlets dissected every moment, from the confrontation on the plane to Elaine's decisive actions at the airport. Passenger testimonies filled news feeds, each retelling painting a picture of injustice but also resilience. Naomi scrolled through her phone, pausing at a video of a woman recounting the exact moment Caroline Porter demanded Naomi's boarding pass for the second time. "She had no reason to question her," the woman said, her voice trembling with frustration. "Why should she have to prove she belongs? She belongs because she's here. Just like the rest of us." Naomi's chest tightened as she read the comments beneath the video. Most were supportive, people praising her for standing her ground. But scattered between them were dismissive remarks, reminders of how far society still had to go. Her phone vibrated with a new notification, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a reminder. Interview at 2 p.m. Naomi's stomach nodded. It would be the first time she addressed the public directly since the incident. Later that afternoon, Naomi sat beneath the bright lights of a studio. The hum of cameras and the quiet shuffle of crew filled the air, grounding her in the moment. The journalist sitting across from her greeted her warmly, but Naomi could feel the intensity beneath the surface. The cameras rolled. As the interview began, Naomi recounted the events of that flight with quiet precision. She described the humiliation, the way her composure wavered but held, and the strength she drew from her mother and from the passengers who had stood by her. The journalist leaned forward, her expression softening. "Naomi, your story has resonated with millions. You've become a symbol of resilience and justice. What do you hope people take away from this?" Naomi paused, letting her thoughts settle. "This isn't just about me," she began, her voice steady but earnest. "It's about the countless people who face these moments every day, often without someone to stand with them. I was lucky. I had my mom, and I had people who believed in me, but so many don't." She turned slightly toward the camera, her eyes unwavering. "If you've ever felt like you didn't belong, know that you do. And if you see someone being treated unfairly, don't stay silent. Be the voice they need. Together, we can create a world where no one questions their worth." The journalist smiled, visibly moved. "Your mother has been a key figure in this. What role has she played through all of this?" Naomi's expression softened. "She's always been my anchor," she said, glancing at the camera. "Watching her lead with strength and compassion has taught me more than I can say. This isn't just about fixing what went wrong, it's about building something better, and she's the reason I believe that's possible." That evening, the interview aired, sparking a flood of online reactions. Viewers filled social media with messages of solidarity, many sharing their own stories of discrimination. Hashtags like "Justice for Naomi" and "Equality in the Air" trended globally, extending far beyond the airline industry. Elaine's reforms began to ripple through the corporate world. Competing airlines quietly announced similar initiatives, eager to avoid the scrutiny that had engulfed Elaine's company. Passengers from other flights came forward, inspired by Naomi's courage to speak out. Naomi scrolled through the endless reactions, her heart swelling with both pride and exhaustion. Her phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Sofia Alvarez. "Thank you for being brave, Naomi. Because of you, I found my voice too." A small smile crept across Naomi's face as she set the phone down. For the first time in days, the weight pressing on her chest felt lighter. The world beyond her window, alive with the soft glow of city lights, felt full of possibility. The fight wasn't over, but they were moving forward, together. Meanwhile, Caroline Porter sat at a small desk in her modest apartment, the soft hum of evening traffic filtering in through the window. The open notebook in front of her lay blank, mirroring the uncertainty that clouded her thoughts. 3 months had passed since her termination. The fallout had been swift and relentless. Her once pristine reputation crumbled under the weight of public scrutiny. Friends distanced themselves. Strangers hurled accusations online. Caroline had once commanded respect. Now she felt hollow, trapped in the quiet of her own regret. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. A reminder for her final diversity and sensitivity training session. This one was different. Facilitator, Sofia Alvarez. Caroline swallowed, the weight of the name settling heavily on her. In the dimly lit training room the next day, Sofia stood at the front, calm but resolute. "Today's session is about confronting bias, especially the ones we don't like to admit we carry," Sofia said, her gaze briefly meeting Caroline's. As participants shared their experiences, Caroline felt her own defenses slowly erode. By the end of the session, she lingered as others left. "I just wanted to say," Caroline began, her voice soft, "I've been reflecting. I'm sorry for how I acted that day. I'm trying to do better." Sofia met her gaze for a long moment before nodding slightly. "Trying is a start," Sofia said gently. "What you choose to do next matters more." Caroline Porter sat in the training room, her hands resting uneasily on her lap. The rows of participants filled the space with hushed conversation, but the quiet buzz did little to ease the knot forming in her stomach. This session felt different. At the front of the room, Sofia Alvarez stood, calm yet commanding. Caroline swallowed hard as Sofia's gaze briefly flicked to her. There was no hostility in Sofia's expression, only the quiet authority of someone who had grown stronger through experience. "Good afternoon, everyone," Sofia began, her voice steady as she scanned the room. "Today's session is about unconscious bias, how it shapes our actions, and more importantly, how we begin to break free from it." Caroline shifted in her seat, her guilt creeping in like a slow tide. Her actions on that flight months ago had been anything but unconscious. They had been deliberate. Rooted in a false sense of authority, they now felt like an unbearable weight. One by one, participants shared stories, small moments of exclusion or assumption that built over time. A middle-aged woman spoke of overlooking younger colleagues. An older man recounted dismissing a coworker based on outdated views. Caroline listened, the stories weaving together a mosaic of shared flaws and growth. Finally, Sofia opened the floor. "If anyone would like to reflect, the space is yours," she said gently. Caroline hesitated. Her heart pounded as she slowly raised her hand. Eyes turned toward her, but she kept her focus on Sofia. "When I started attending these sessions," Caroline began, her voice wavering, "I told myself I didn't need to be here. I thought I was above this." Her words hung heavy in the room. "But I realize now I was wrong," she continued, forcing herself to meet the eyes of the people around her. "I caused harm because I was unwilling to see past my own biases. I thought I was just following protocol, but the truth is, I wasn't. I see that now." Caroline swallowed against the tightness in her throat. "I know an apology can't undo the damage, but I'm committed to doing better, to being better." A long silence followed. Sofia's expression softened as she met Caroline's gaze. "Acknowledgement is a step," Sofia said quietly, "but what matters most is what you choose to do next." That evening, Caroline sat at her desk, the weight of the day pressing down on her. She opened a notebook and let the words flow. "Dear Naomi and Elaine, I want to express my deepest regret for my actions on that flight. What I did was inexcusable, and I am truly sorry for the pain I caused. The past few months have been a journey of unlearning and reflection. I'm beginning to understand the privilege I held and the harm it allowed me to perpetuate. I am not the same person I was then. I am committed to continuing this work, not just for myself, but for the people around me." Thank you for holding me accountable. Your courage has been a catalyst for change, and I hope that one day I can contribute to the solution rather than the problem." With humility and sincerity, Caroline folded the letter carefully, sealing it as if it held something fragile. For the first time in months, she felt a flicker of hope. Days later, Naomi sat in her apartment, the letter resting unopened on her coffee table. Elaine sat across from her, watching as Naomi traced the edges of the envelope with her fingertips. "Have you read it yet?" Elaine asked gently. Naomi shook her head, her eyes fixed on the envelope. "Not yet," she replied. "I'm not sure I'm ready." Elaine leaned forward, placing a comforting hand over Naomi's. "Forgiveness isn't about letting someone off the hook," Elaine said softly. "It's about freeing yourself from the weight of what they did. Whatever you decide, it's your choice and no one else's." Naomi nodded slowly, the conflict within her palpable. The anger and pain lingered, but beneath it all, the faintest stirrings of compassion began to rise. "I need time," Naomi said finally. Elaine smiled gently. "Take all the time you need." Naomi picked up the envelope, holding it in her hands for a long moment before placing it in a drawer. She didn't need to decide today. As Naomi closed the drawer, she looked out at the city skyline. The world beyond her window moved forward, and so would she. In her heart, she understood that forgiveness wasn't about Caroline. It was about finding peace for herself. 1 year later, the sun rose over New York City, casting warm light across glass buildings and filling the morning air with quiet optimism. For Naomi Ellis, it marked a milestone, one she hadn't anticipated but now embraced. A full year had passed since the flight that had shifted the trajectory of her life. She stood at the entrance of the conference hall, her navy suit tailored to perfection. Her natural hair framed her face in soft waves, exuding a quiet confidence. Inside, the hall buzzed with energy. Industry leaders, activists, media figures, and airline employees had gathered for an event titled Higher Ground, Redefining Equality in the Skies. The event wasn't just a celebration of progress. It was a call to continue dismantling systemic biases within the airline industry. Naomi took a deep breath, steadying herself. This wasn't just her moment. It belonged to everyone who had stood by her, to the passengers who spoke out, to the countless individuals who endured similar experiences in silence. The room quieted as Elaine Ellis took the stage, her presence commanding as always. "A year ago," Elaine began, "our airline faced a moment of reckoning." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the audience. What began as an incident of discrimination revealed deeper issues, not just within our company, but across our industry and beyond. Her gaze swept the room. "Today we celebrate the progress we've made, but more importantly, we reaffirm our commitment to lasting change." Elaine smiled, motioning toward Naomi. "It's my honor to introduce someone who turned pain into purpose, a moment into a movement. My daughter, Naomi Ellis." Applause erupted as Naomi stepped onto the stage, her heart pounding. She met her mother's reassuring gaze, and for the first time, Naomi felt the weight on her chest lift entirely. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Naomi Ellis stood quietly near the entrance of the bustling conference hall, watching as attendees filtered into their seats. The hum of conversations and camera flashes created an electric energy, but Naomi stayed grounded, her tailored navy suit a subtle reflection of the confidence she had grown into over the past year. Inside, the room overflowed with industry leaders, activists, media figures, and employees from Ellis International Airlines, her mother's company. The event, Higher Ground Redefining Equality in the Skies, wasn't just a celebration. It was a marker of change, a moment that symbolized how far they had come, and how much further they still had to go. Naomi inhaled deeply, steadying herself. This moment wasn't hers alone. It belonged to everyone who had spoken out, who had demanded better. The crowd quieted as Elaine Ellis stepped onto the stage. Her presence, as always, commanded attention. Elaine's words were measured but powerful, carrying the weight of both authority and compassion. 1 year ago, Elaine began, her voice echoing across the hall. Our airline faced a moment of reckoning. What started as an incident of discrimination uncovered deeper issues, not just within our company, but across the industry and beyond. She paused, letting her words sink into the crowd. Today, we gather to recognize the progress we've made, but more importantly, we reaffirm our commitment to equality, accountability, and lasting change." Naomi caught her mother's eye from across the room, and a quiet exchange of strength passed between them. "This journey has been far from easy," Elaine continued, sweeping her gaze over the crowd. "But progress rarely is. It requires courage, persistence, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths." Elaine's voice softened, but her conviction remained steady. "And it requires voices like the one I am honored to introduce now, someone who has turned pain into purpose, a moment into a movement. Ladies and gentlemen, my daughter, Naomi Ellis." The room erupted into applause as Naomi stepped onto the stage. Her pulse quickened, but as she approached the podium and met her mother's reassuring gaze, her confidence solidified. "Thank you, Mom," Naomi began, her voice steady and clear. "And thank you to everyone here today." She looked out at the faces before her, each one reflecting the collective hope and determination that had fueled this journey. "A year ago," Naomi continued, "I boarded a flight expecting nothing more than a quiet trip home. Instead, I found myself in a situation that forced me to confront an all-too-common reality, the feeling of being unseen, unheard, and undervalued." Her voice softened, drawing the audience in closer. "What happened on that flight was painful and deeply personal. But it became something bigger than me. It became a catalyst for change. Thanks to the courage of passengers who spoke up, the support of strangers, and the leadership of a mother who has always taught me to stand tall, even when the world tries to knock you down." The room was silent, the audience hanging on to every word. This past year has been a journey, not just for me, but for all of us. We've seen what's possible when people come together, when voices unite to demand better. And we've learned that change doesn't happen overnight. It's a process, a series of choices to listen, to learn, and to act. Naomi's gaze swept across the room, her voice growing firmer. "To those who've experienced discrimination, know this: you are not alone. Your voice matters, and your story has the power to inspire change." She paused, feeling the weight of the moment settle over the room. "And to those in positions of power, I urge you to use it wisely. Create spaces where everyone feels valued, where equality isn't just an aspiration, but a reality." The applause that followed was thunderous, echoing throughout the hall like a wave of collective resolve. Later, as the event continued, Naomi wandered through the crowd, engaging with attendees who shared their stories. Sofia Alvarez approached her, a warm smile lighting up her face. "You were incredible up there," Sofia said, her voice filled with admiration. Naomi smiled in return. "Thank you, and thank you for everything you've done this past year. Your courage that day made all the difference." Sofia's expression grew thoughtful. "I think we all learned something that day," Sofia replied. "And I'm just glad to see how far we've come." Their conversation was interrupted by an older woman who stepped forward, tears brimming in her eyes. "Miss Ellis," the woman said, her voice trembling, "thank you. What you've done has given people like me hope. My daughter saw your story and decided to speak up at her job. You've changed more lives than you'll ever know." Naomi's throat tightened as she reached out, clasping the woman's hands. "Thank you for sharing that," Naomi said softly. "It means more than I can say." As the evening wound down, Naomi stepped outside onto a balcony, the cool air brushing against her skin. The city lights stretched endlessly before her, a tapestry of possibility. Elaine joined her, standing quietly by her side. "Lost in thought?" Elaine asked gently. Naomi smiled faintly, her eyes lingering on the horizon. "Just thinking about how far we've come," Naomi said, "and how far we still have to go." Elaine placed an arm around Naomi's shoulders. "It's overwhelming at times," Elaine admitted. "But it's worth it. Change doesn't happen in one grand moment. It's a series of moments like this that move us closer to where we need to be." Naomi nodded, the weight on her chest easing. "We're stronger together," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. "Always," Elaine replied. A few weeks later, Naomi boarded another flight. As she settled into her seat, a flight attendant approached with a warm smile. "Miss Ellis, it's an honor to have you on board," the attendant said, her voice filled with genuine respect. Naomi smiled, feeling the shift in the air. "Thank you," she replied. "It's good to be here." As the plane ascended, Naomi glanced out the window, the horizon stretching endlessly ahead. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time, Naomi felt certain they were on the right path. Naomi Ellis stood at the edge of the balcony, the city lights shimmering below like scattered stars. With the support of her mother, Elaine, and the strength she had cultivated within herself, she had turned a painful experience into something larger, a movement that would echo far beyond her own life. But Naomi's journey wasn't over. This was just the beginning. Her story, marked by resilience, unity, and courage, would inspire countless others to stand tall in the face of injustice. Naomi's path served as a testament to the power found in collective action and the unshakable belief that change is possible when we choose to confront inequality head-on. If you were in Naomi's shoes, how would you respond to discrimination? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters, and your stories can help drive the conversation forward. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like and share to spread the message of justice and resilience. Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories that remind us all of the strength found in hope and solidarity. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.